Hello, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we're going to be talking about the Great Mink Cull of 2020, which occurred during the pandemic. We're going to be talking about what sort of events led up to this cull, what the cull entailed, and the lasting impact that has on our lives. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. So when we think about the pandemic, we think of it in the rearview mirror, a lot of us. Now that mask mandates have been lifted and social distancing requirements have been relaxed, people have kind of gone about their lives and they want to forget and they want to move on. And naturally, that's a normal part of dealing with a public health crisis and dealing with something that has affected our lives so deeply. However, for the people who are living with long COVID, the immunocompromised, and those who have died, obviously the pandemic is a reality that will shape our lives for many, many years to come. And it's not just human lives that are affected, although we often think it's a human-centered event. Animals, of course, play a central, important role in understanding the pandemic and understanding how it unfolded. So today I'm going to be talking specifically about one event that was shaped by the pandemic, and that was the Great Mink Cull, or the Mink Cull of 2020. So first of all, what is a mink? Mink is a member of the mustelids, the weasel family. That includes your weasels, your stoats, your otters, your ferrets, that kind of thing. When we think about minks, there's two distinct species. There is the American weasel and there's the European weasel. Interestingly enough, the one we'll be talking mostly about today is the American weasel, even though it is kept in fur farms in Europe, so it's a little confusing. Its primary reason for being kept in captivity is for its fur. So animals are raised until they reach an appropriate size, and then they are killed so that their fur can be harvested and then used for coats and other kinds of luxury wear, that kind of thing. The major producers in the world in 2019 were China, Denmark, Netherlands, and Poland, although there are mink farms pretty much throughout the northern hemisphere. The major importer of mink furs is China. It still is today, but other parts of the world are obviously importing as well, United States, Canada, Europe, that kind of thing as well. So mink fur was a huge industry and affected many, many parts of the world, but this was all shaken up by the pandemic. In 2019, 2020, there were about 1,200 mink farms in Denmark, so it had one of the highest densities of mink farms in the world. It's hard to get numbers on other parts, but we can tell that there's quite a few mink there, and the pandemic made a lot of differences there too. So let me give you a kind of a timeline of events here. So in March of 2020, that's kind of when we start to see lockdowns taking place in Western Europe and North America. In the end of April, we start to see that mink are being having mass mortality rates. There's reports of mass mortality rates in mink in the Netherlands. Necropsies, which is basically an autopsy done on an animal, show that they have what's called interstitial pneumonia. So interstitial pneumonia is a type of pneumonia often associated with viruses. And from the necropsy samples of the lungs, they identify COVID-19 as a suspect. Now, mink aren't the only animals that can be affected by COVID-19 other than humans. We have cats, dogs, big cats like lions and tigers, great apes like gorillas, obviously the bats and the pangolins, but the mink is another species that can be affected by it. Now, mink have a very similar protein to human beings called the ACE2 receptor. That is the one that COVID binds to with the spike protein, basically, and that's how it invades the cell. So with mink, they have this kind of analogous symmetry or similarity with, very similar proteins here, and that allows them to infect them very easily. Now, the mink here will range of clinical signs from subclinical, so they hadn't shown any clinical signs, to death, and everywhere in between, pneumonia, coughing, respiratory signs. Kind of like with human beings, there was the whole gamut of them, basically. Now, the reports of this were alarming for several reasons. One of them is that this was a new species that was being infected with COVID-19. That's always a cause for concern because this is now a new reservoir species, a new place for the virus to mutate, a new place for the virus to be harbored, basically. The other thing that really concerned us was the type of farming that's typically done for mink. Now, The word factory farming gets thrown around quite a bit. I think it's a meaningless categorization. In many respects, any farm that's made under a current mode of or market economy is a factory farm. It's done for profit, and animals are sold in kind of an assembly line. But that aside, if you wanted to think of a factory farm, this is something that would come to mind. There are battery cages, so cages that are kept in close proximity, wire racks, kind of loose bedding, basically to capture urine and feces, animals kept in very, very close proximity to each other. There is a huge potential for a virus that gets into here to spread quickly between animals. The other factor here is with the loose bedding, it caused soiled fecal particles in the bedding to actually cause respiratory aerosols that could spread to other mink as well as to human handlers and human workers in these farms. So there's a huge potential for outbreaks in these kind of situations with the dense packing of animals together and these soiled particles in the air. There's interspecies transfer. We know that human beings could give it to mink, and it was quickly discovered that mink can give it to human beings. Now, in the Netherlands, they were quick to respond by quarantining the farms that were affected and ordering the cull specifically of the farms that were affected. So culling is a term for a mass euthanasia, so the herd is destroyed. This is done as humanely as possible, although that's not always possible to do, as we'll talk about in a few minutes here. But in this case, they were pretty quick to act, and they were pretty quick to close off the farms. Now, the Netherlands had a timeline for eliminating the fur farms in the country. Now, mink farms have long been associated with the animal rights movement and the animal welfare movement as a principal target for legislation against it. Because, of course, animals need to be killed in order to produce fur. This isn't something where, they can live for several years and, have a good life and, then be humanely killed for their fur. No, these animals live very short lives, and they're kept in these conditions that are squalid conditions in many cases. Or how it's been categorized maybe libelously, but in these conditions that have been criticized as being this way, I should say. And this has led to a public outcry against them and has put the fur industry on the back foot. The Netherlands was planning on banning it eventually, but they accelerated the timeline to the end of the year. Now, of course, quickly reports came up in other countries that had this, the Poland, Netherlands, Italy, Canada, the United States. China didn't make any reports of this, but I'm sure it was happening there too, of these mink farms having these outbreaks of this SARS CoV-2 virus, this COVID-19 virus, basically. So the Denmark situation is a little bit complicated here, but I'm going to do my best to summarize it. A lot of the sources here are in Danish. I don't speak it, unfortunately, so I don't really know the nuances of the situation. I'm going based off the English language reports. I read a little bit on the Wikipedia. I have some of the articles that I'm citing in the source description. Danish people, if I'm getting things wrong, or if I'm getting the timeline wrong, or if I'm glossing over details, that's why, unfortunately. But essentially what happens here is that Denmark reports pretty early on that they're getting outbreaks on these fur farms, and that mink are being infected by them. Now, in October, some disturbing reports arise from these mink fur farms that there is a variant mutation forming in the mink fur farms. So the virus has moved from humans to minks and has mutated. Where still, this mutated virus has jumped from minks back to humans. The fear was, and this wasn't necessarily established, but this was the fear, was that when this virus mutated, the vaccines that were being developed at the time would no longer be effective against that variant of the mutant virus. It's kind of out of control, and that even with all our best efforts, this variant mutant would no longer respond to the vaccines. Now we know that vaccines respond to variants post hoc, but at the time this wasn't known. So there was fears, and critics would call this, I don't know exactly how politically correct this is, but they call this the potential for a second new Wuhan, a new site for a virus to emerge. Potentially even deadlier, potentially resistant to vaccines. Now, this sparked huge fears in the Danish health authorities. Imagine you're them. You're hearing that there's this new COVID virus that has already caused a large amount of panic in the world, that has shut down your fur farms, that has threatened your economy, and now you're going to be the site of a new pandemic at your doorstep. what do you do? Well, they came to the quick decision at the beginning of November 4th, they announced this decision that all mink farms would have to cull their herds, whether or not they've been exposed to COVID-19, as quickly as possible, and they're phasing up production immediately. Imagine you're a fur farmer in this situation, you're hearing this, and you're saying, what? My fur farm has never had a case of COVID-19 confirmed. Well, suddenly that is the Brexit. Basically, all these fur farms in the country are now going to have to destroy their entire herd, their entire source of income, because of this public health crisis. Now, the reports of this, of course, I mean, anytime there's going to be a mass culling of a number of animals, there's going to be a huge outcry. And that's inevitable, basically, because, of course, this is going to be huge, devastating economic loss for the producers. It's also going to be a huge loss of life for the animals. So there's that. There's humane concerns with euthanasia, and there were disturbing videos that came out. I'm not going to show any because of YouTube and gross, no. Of animals being improperly and inhumanely euthanized or botched euthanasias. That is kind of what happens in these mass, euthanasia situations. I think one of the things that might have made it worse was the fact that the Danish government said, we'll give you extra money if you do it quickly enough. And that kind of spurred these hastily botched euthanasia episodes. Once the minks were euthanized, they were buried in mass graves. So they dug a trench and they buried them all in there with some topsoil over top of it. Unfortunately, those mink would bloat and rise out of their shallow graves in this kind of horrifying scene, and then they would need to be cremated. So it became a massive destruction. 17 million estimated mink were destroyed during this massive mink cull, which is just profoundly disturbing as a number, and you can only imagine what that would look like on the ground. I'll post a few pictures here kind of showing you what that would look like, but you're gonna have to multiply this by several log factors to get the idea. So what was the outcome here? Well, fortunately, this wasn't the new Wuhan. Fortunately, there was no massive outbreak of the virus, and this mutant variant didn't pose a huge risk to human life, and it didn't cause a vaccine-resistant variant. It did cause some major political scandal in Denmark, though. It turned out with the so-called Mink Commission, great name, and the political controversy called Minkgate, which I don't like the use of gate, but Minkgate is just hilarious. It turned out that the government of Denmark illegally ordered the destruction and culling of all these mink. They didn't have the proper authorization to do it, and this caused a huge controversy with the Social Democrat Party, which forced an election. Now, actually, the Social Democrat Party actually got off fine. They managed to keep their majority by 1 seat, and it actually caused huge losses for the Conservative Party. But anyway, that was in 2022, so it happened a couple years after the fact when this commission was digging through this stuff. The farmers that were affected by the cull still have not received the full economic compensation for the cull. They're going to have to wait probably another 4 or 5 years until they see that. These are the things that take time with government, and in the meantime, they're kind of stuck on their own. They've completely lost their business and their way of life. So there is that aspect as well. The Copenhagen Fur Auction House, which used to be one of the largest fur auction houses in the world, that had lasted for about 90 years, actually is closing their operations this year because of the mink cull. So they announced that, I think that was last year or the year before. So what they're going to do is they're going to liquidate the remaining stock that they have of furs, and then they're going to stop operations later this year because, first of all, the market demand is completely shot, and the market's been so disrupted by the pandemic that it's just not economically feasible to keep up with this anymore. So those sort of things are in effect here as well. There's also the fact that this caused probably an irreversible decline in the mink fur industry worldwide. In my own country, they are, of course, banning mink productions province by province, so it's going to be piecemeal, phasing it out. Other parts of the world are phasing out their mink production as well. And the public health angle of this is just, of course, mind-blowing. So what do we learn from all of this? I mean, this kind of seemed like a blip on the radar for many people who living through the effects of the pandemic, having family members getting sick or dying. people who have experienced long COVID, people who are immunocompromised, people who had worsening mental health under lockdown and quarantine, the political stuff with that happened in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. This seems like a blip on the radar, but we can't forget about it entirely because there are a few lessons to learn here. I think the most important is that anytime we have these mass concentrations of population with animals, it always poses a public health risk. And mitigating those risks is important to preventing public health crises all over the place. So this isn't just mink farms, this isn't just, that kind of thing. It's also, swine, dairy cattle, beef cattle, chickens for layers and for broilers, all sorts of things. And if we don't take lessons away from this and we don't try to reform or at least severely curtail or eliminate some of these industries, then they're going to pose future zoonotic health risks to our society. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. Other things to keep in mind too is that when liberal governments say that it'll take years for this to be phased out, that's not true. The Danish government said, you guys need to destroy your herds now. And they completely banned mink farming basically by the end of the year. They effectively destroyed their entire industry was liquidated in about a month. And not for humane reasons, but for public health reasons. So this is something that, people who've been fighting for animal rights and animal welfare, talking about these fur farms for years, that have been campaigning for their destruction and then being told, you have to let the process work itself out. This is going to be a long fight. Sometimes the government will just simply ignore the law and just declare certain things off limits. And I think the third and final thing here is that there needs to be a just transition because, the producers aren't necessarily at fault for this pandemic and for this outbreak that happened with the mink fur farms. They were just trying to, live and work in an economy that had a demand for furs. And if we don't try to, of course, have a just transition and, something that encourages them to switch to a different industry or reskill them or offer them retirement or offer, insurance or university education for their children, things like that, they're going to be left in the dust. And it's not just mink farms. We think about other places, other sites where there could potentially be zoonotic diseases and huge outcomes, devastating for communities. We need to have a transition in place so that we don't just leave people in the dust to the cruel market, basically, and just letting them die, right? It sounds wild to say, but this is an example of climate change affecting. Climate change has been associated with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're going to see more things like this as more zoonotic pathogens start to emerge and start to wreak havoc all over the place. What are we going to do with people who are forced out of their industry? Their industry just evaporates overnight. And that is a huge political question that needs to be addressed as well. So that's all I have for today. I tried to cover this as, thorough detail as I could without going for too long. It's shorter than the video 2 weeks ago, but hopefully you enjoyed that. And if you didn't, of course, leave me a comment. Or if you did, I'd love to hear what you thought, or if you have questions about this. Danish speakers, if you want to read some of the news articles or tell me where I'm wrong, I would really appreciate that, because I was trying to learn as much as I could. I didn't have a translator available that could translate Danish to English, and I did the best I could trying to read the news articles from the Western North American English media perspective, but may have left it a little bit limited. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Peace.